originally known as Macaulay Town after Dr. James Macaulay, the first owner of the land, the area officially referred to as St. John's Ward, later only the Ward, was conceived for being a slum in 1850. Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, two African-American fugitive slaves from Kentucky brought to Toronto via the Underground Railroad, were early landowners who helped relocate other fleeing forced labor from the American South. As a result, many of the first faces of the ward were African Americans. Incidentally, Thornton and Lucy Blackburn started Toronto's first taxi cab company. Thanks to its location relatively close to Union Station and the harbour, the ward was often the first port of call for new arrivals to Toronto and penniless human beings fleeing poverty elsewhere in the world. Many Irish forced out by the potato famine of 1845 settled into the ramshackle homes which cluttered the land bounded by Elizabeth and Tyrolean, later Bay Streets, in the mid to late 1800s. In the early 20th century, things didn't change much. And if you were poor and just arrived in Toronto, there was a good chance that you would end up living somewhere in the ward. By the time an infamous, densely populated shanty town delimited by modern Queen, College, Yonge and University. In the following decades, the ward was at various times Toronto's Chinatown, Little Italy and the core of the Jewish community. Large part of its Irish, Chinese, Eastern European and African population would find a home there, although living conditions were universally bleak, especially during Toronto's freezing winters. Landlords fractioned the crowded parcels of land containing sparse homes, shacks, shelters and other dwellings with the purpose of gaining the highest possible rental return. Consequently, the overcrowding problem affecting the area worsened as people gathered together to better afford their living costs. In many cases, 6 or more people would crowd a small, filthy room. The unbearable presence of poverty and destitution in the ward pushed the city to try and clean up the area, usually by finding ways of demolishing parts of it. The transformations incurred by the ward were very frequent and entailed a significant modification of the urban structure of the lower sectors of Toronto. Around the turn of the 20th century, parts of the ward were expropriated to make way for the old, then new, City Hall in 1899. A few years later, in 1909, 8 acres of land were demolished as Toronto General Hospital was built on Elizabeth Street. Due to the reduction in space and increase in overcrowding, the Jewish community, until then the most numerous ethnic presence in the ward, began to move west into the Kensington Market area. As the Jewish community left the neighborhood, this began to change in character and the ward increasingly became a center for Italian immigrants who were then arriving in great numbers. In the meantime, the Great Depression came and swept away the grandiose city plans of opening up a Parisian-like tree-lined boulevard called Federal Avenue to connect Union Station and Queen Street. By the Second World War, the ward had become Toronto's first Chinatown, and the Italians of the city started populating the main Little Italy around College and Grace Streets, while the Italian presence developed fast in the neighborhood around Dufferin and Davenport that had been established back in the 1890s. This would soon become known as Little Italy. In the 1950s, Italian Canadians from Little Italy headed northwest up Dufferin past St. Clair Avenue and were joined by a new wave of immigrants from Italy. By the 1960s, the Dufferin-St. Clair area, known as Corso Italia, had supplanted the College Grace neighborhood as the largest center of Toronto's Italian community. Meanwhile, the ward ceased to exist when the first Chinatown center on Elizabeth Street was expropriated in the 1950s to make way for Nathan Phillips Square, named after Toronto's popular first Jewish mayor, with most businesses moving west to establish what is now considered the old Chinatown at Spadina Avenue and Dundas Street. The old slum left the Italian community with at least one prominent son. Johnny Lombardi, a champion of multiculturalism before multiculturalism, who was born in Trinity Square in 1915, went on to found one of the first multilingual radio stations in Canada, Chin Radio, in 1966. By 1968, Mr. Toronto's radiophonic enterprise was broadcasting in 32 languages, with Italian language programming predominant at 60 hours per week. Now known as the Discovery District for its high concentration of hospitals and research institutions, particularly in biotechnology, What was once the Ward, one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, is the bustling hub of Toronto's administration and healthcare.